Right, so I'll get cracking just to give you a bit of an intro here. So this is, to check you're in the right place, this is a webinar on the consultation that's currently out for a common policy on community benefit and shared ownership. And one of the first things that I thought would be useful to talk about is the context, because in the actual consultation document, there isn't a lot around that context and how we've arrived here. So the little scribbly diagram I put on the left is basically there to illustrate that it's a bit messy at the moment, what happens. So, and the current situation isn't fair because it's not consistent, nor is it transparent, nor is it particularly organised. And to give some examples of that, if you look nationally, in Scotland in particular, also Wales, but Scotland in particular has done very well in terms of having guidance for expectations of voluntary community benefit funding and contributions to be made by private developers. And there's data showing that they're achieving those benchmarks when you look across the projects. And they've also created a culture and expectation that leads to more, I think it's fair to say, more shared ownership. I don't have the stats on that, but certainly when I've looked for examples, they've been in Scotland. And so they're doing something well there, and it's not happening in the same way, particularly in England, where there isn't any guidance in the same way as they have there or in Wales. And then if you look more locally, so those of you who are closer to West Oxford, Woodstock, etc., there has been a very, very large solar farm proposed called Botley West. It's one of those things, if you're near it, you can't get away from it. If you're not so close, you might never have heard of it. But that is an example, I think, where we can really improve. And I think everybody that's been involved in the process thinks that we can improve, because nobody really knew who was leading on discussions about where community benefits, where those decisions would be made, who would be involved in that. We had, I think it's fair to say, and recognised by the councils that at various points they thought somebody else was making the decision, and actually we had communications from the county council saying they weren't making a decision, but actually it was someone from the county council that was involved in that decision in the end. And I don't think that there was anything that was ill-intended in that messiness, but it was certainly messy. There were a lot of parish councils in the area, kind of local and hosting that particular project. And I think it's also fair to say they didn't know what had hit them. It took a very long time to get people together. And I think, and this is a personal opinion, but I think I was seeing closing of ranks in a way. There was a kind of like, oh, we have to work out what we think about this before we talk to anybody else. So again, personal opinion, but frankly, I think it's a miracle that the agreement on the community benefit funding from that project was as high as it was. And we'd certainly say it could be higher. There may be a national requirement that's coming on this, but it will be a way off. So in terms of shared ownership of projects, that has been the government set an intention to start working through the process for achieving that, but it will take a couple of years. And they've actually not said anything for a while about community benefit funds, but in any case, it would likely take the same amount of time, or, you know, a year if they were going to do some guidance. But they haven't indicated that they're working on that actively. So in the meantime, there are projects coming forwards that, you know, a more joined up approach across all of the councils, but also us as a community energy sector, or communities that are hosting those projects, will mean that we're more likely to get benefit from them, and in any kind of form. And also it's a period where, you know, we can get ahead of the curve, because if there is a national mandate coming, we want to have kind of got ready for that. And when there's more volume, because it's a requirement and it's no longer voluntary, actually we're not kind of headless chickens. We've got on top of it already. I think the last thing I just wanted to say on this is there's another context here, which is local government reorganisation. So there's local government reorganisation in terms of changes with the district and county, and there's also discussions about devolution and the possibility of having a strategic authority. Whatever happens there, it puts a bit of a pause on some decisions, and it also means that you've just things need to be transferred into whatever the new authority and the new people in different roles are. Having a joined up approach to this that's agreed by the current set of councils means that it's on the table going into whatever the new institutions look like. And so that's another thing that we've kind of got in. There's a kind of a reason why it's important right now in terms of getting that on that table and ready to be in, finding the appropriate inbox for whoever's in charge of this kind of topic later on. So next bit, concepts. I think probably most people on this call will be familiar with this, but I can answer questions later if need be. So you can click on how. So community-owned energy, broadly speaking, you've got a generating asset or perhaps some battery storage as well. It's producing power, which is exported to the grid, and that is sold usually on a power purchase agreement with a supplier. The money that you then have from that sale, some of it has to cover operating costs. And if it's a community benefit society model, which is what I've illustrated here, that would include repayments to community shareholders. You obviously pay any tax that you're due. And what you're left over with as a trading surplus is often in the sector referred to generally as community benefit. Whereas in this consultation, it talks specifically about community benefit contributions, and there's a reason for that. So Hal, if you could go on to this next slide, which is the privately owned model. Very similar, exporting power to the grid, selling that for an income, covering your operating costs and tax, and then what would be your profit, which would normally all go to your shareholders, you may at the moment voluntarily decide to create a community benefit contribution, which can be paying for in-kind provision of things, but more commonly it's a provision of some kind of community benefit fund, and then it is the local community that are deciding how that is spent. And so the key message is that in this model, because the purpose of the company that's running this is to distribute, can we pop back, Hal? Is to distribute to the shareholders, that community benefit contribution tends to be a lot smaller. So shared ownership is one of the other things that this consultation talks about. And I mean, I've just done the quickest of illustrations, which is to say there's lots of models for this, but essentially it's a bit of a combination of both. And the illustration that I've put up here essentially takes the same two models and kind of splits the site into proportions, where one part is owned and operated by the community and the other part is owned and operated by the private company. There are slightly different ways of doing it. It can be on a split income basis as well. But again, it's really just to point out two things. You get more community benefit from community ownership, and actually it's not mutually exclusive. So you can have both a community benefit contribution from the private side of that, as well as that larger wider community benefits trading surplus on the community owned side of it. So if we can click on what's actually in this is very high level. So it's a consultation on a draft interim policy for community benefit contributions and community shared ownership for low carbon energy projects in Oxfordshire. Next one, Hal. And at the highest level, it's really, really quite simple. The policy statement is that all of Oxfordshire's councils are signing up, or assuming it's adopted, will sign up to a joint policy that says they expect private for-profit developers of certain types of low carbon projects to voluntarily provide a community benefit contribution and offer opportunities for shared ownership. And so it's really about being joined up at the heart of it. That's the main thing that this does. And then obviously there's lots of qualifiers and definitions and things. So if you click on how, the devil is therefore in the detail. And the consultation document then goes on to set out what their proposals would be for the scope of this in terms of scales of projects that would qualify, what types of technologies, what they mean by community benefit contribution and shared ownership. They have a whole series of guiding principles around how negotiations should be done, or they'd expect them to be done for both community benefit contributions and shared ownership opportunities, and so on and so forth. Representation, calculation of contributions, how community benefit contribution funds would be managed, what the roles and responsibilities are, and some bits there about that being to deliver community action plans. And then they also have this shared ownership route map, which we can come back to in the discussion if we want to. So that's where all of the detail, and it's a long document and it's a long survey to fill in. But as I say, at the heart of it, it's really just saying all the councils sign up to say that they expect these contributions and these opportunities to be made, and they're all on the same page. Let's click on Hal. So what's our perspective? Again, similarly high level for the moment. Broadly, we think this is a very good idea. So going from not having a joined up position and not having coordination on this to having it is definitely a win from our perspective. And so we're very much supportive of it. And in fact, it's been my role for Low Carbon Hub. I've been supporting the team that's at the County Council who've been leading on developing this draft policy to help them shape that because we're supportive of it. And that's not to say that I love everything that's in it, but I think that it's well intentioned. And we also made sure that when they were doing some early pre-consultation engagement, that they had other representatives from the community energy sector involved in that. So if you click on Hal, and this is kind of a response to the detail, there is a lot of detail in this, and our concern is that could easily turn into a lot of red tape, and that you get a very kind of bureaucratic, administrative heavy process. So our other message is be nimble, be light-footed in the approach to implementation. Start with a simple approach with the fewest rules that you need, and then allow whoever is involved in that as projects come forwards to apply the guidance and to learn. And if more kind of strict restrictions or constraints or guidance or requirements are needed, then they're introduced because they really are needed and not because of a kind of, I think there's a risk of a theoretical over-engineered solution to something because of the anticipation of lots of complexity. And actually in practice, 5 projects come forward, and by the time you've been through 5 of them, you've got this down in a much more nimble way. Next slide. So what can you do? Please respond to the consultation. We absolutely encourage everybody to do that, whatever your position on it is, and do, of course, share that within your network. The more people who are responding, the better quality response we'll have from our councils. And if you are in favour broadly, as we are, then that the more likely we are to give them the evidence basis that they need to go ahead. At the moment, it's out for consultation on the draft. The next stage will be that they'll revise the draft, and then they will take that to the joint leaders group for all the councils, and it will go out to the councils to decide if they want to adopt this and sign up. And so actually getting this on the radar of local politicians early would also be a good idea. Let them know what your position is. And we have said in our case, certainly asking them to support the policy. That's our position. So scope, this is where they talk about the size of projects. So they have a threshold of 5 megawatts capacity in the case of solar farms, and it's broadly similar, I think, for the other ones. Off the top of my head, I've forgotten. Which types of technologies are involved and definitions. Most of this follows the government paper that came out last year. Most of it's absolutely fine. And we have one point it's a very specific detail that we disagree with in here. In their document, they talk about, so they describe community benefit contributions in the case of a privately owned project, and then they talk about the community benefit that arises from a community owned part of that project, whether it's shared ownership or if you've completely acquired the whole thing. Recognizing that you get that net trading surplus point that gives you greater community benefit. And in the document, it says that benefit, that they call it community shared ownership benefit, and they give it an acronym because local government people like acronyms. They say that should be invested in Oxfordshire, and we completely disagree with that. For a couple of reasons, but the main one being there's absolutely no legal basis for it. The reason that the government has a preference and can put its support behind community ownership is because in the community ownership models, so ours is a community benefit society, West Mills are co-ops, there is the FCA that registers the organisations and keeps accountability on whether they are fulfilling their objects and the statutory basis in which they've been established. So you don't need additional requirements placed on that. And also there's no basis for the councils to do that. If they were grant funding, so when we are grant funded, we do have constraints on how we can spend that money, obviously. And if we're contracted to do something, there are constraints on how you spend that money. But when it comes to essentially running a community-owned business, we don't think they should be doing that. We also don't like it because if a project comes up on the borders of, at the moment, this would be Oxfordshire, it doesn't make sense to be restricting the community benefit that arises from that project within the county. You could have, it's kind of like saying you can spend it on somebody on the other side of the county, but you can't invest it on the village that's a few miles away across the border. So that in itself doesn't seem to make sense to us. So yeah, it's actually quite a tiny bit in that section of the document, but we feel quite strongly about it. Otherwise, very happy with it. The next bit is guiding principles. Again, I haven't kind of gone into listing all of these, but it's things like transparency and so on. Again, mostly fine. And this is one of the big bits where we just think, don't over-engineer things and make sure that it's explicit that these guiding principles are there to guide. But actually, the point is you have, in each case, you're identifying who it is that's doing something, that's getting involved in a negotiation, or who it is from the communities that are, for example, in your case, Oliver, who are forming a steering group or kind of coming together to be representatives. And then you are working through that nimbly, and you're just taking the guidance to be helpful. My slight worry is that you could read it as going down a line of somebody in a council somewhere is going to come and try and hold people accountable because they have not, to the nth bullet point in their list of guidance, done exactly what it says there. And that's not the point of it. And it doesn't make that explicit. So we think that they should make it explicit. But again, it's mostly fine. There's not much to disagree with from our perspective. Community representation, probably picked this up in the answer to Oliver, to your question. As I say, what I've said here on the slide was that actually the question does benefit most from very place-based organisations and people in the community, because we are operating mostly on a county regional basis. So actually we can't respond in that way that would be particular to any particular instance of a project. But it would be really great to get diverse examples from different areas. And I don't think it matters whether they apply elsewhere or not. It's that the diversity of the responses, I think, will send a message that says, know who you think is likely, but be flexible and be curious as to who might be a really appropriate person to be representing community interests in any given particular instance. Calculation of community benefit contributions. Yes, I'm very supportive of this. Our position will be very supportive of this. It is, I think, fair to say that there's a bit of a pragmatic element to our support for this. The proposals that are in there are, I would say, at the high end of what they can realistically expect to achieve, given where the benchmarks are in terms of the guidance in Scotland and kind of wider national discourse on this. So that's not to say that I wouldn't like them to be higher, but I think what they're proposing is probably at the high end of what pragmatically is likely to go through. And I do think that they're likely to get responses from developers arguing the case for lower levels. So I would like to give them as much support and evidence to say that the higher levels are well worth it, and that there's plenty that funding can be used for that will actually genuinely help communities be accepting and get involved and get the benefits from this energy transition as it's happening. The next one, I've kind of bundled these together. They're in the same section of the document, but the proposal includes both local and strategic funds. So I guess in the example of Botley West, that's local funds because all of it is going to be administered fingers crossed, Oliver, that the process goes smoothly through that community interest company, and is there's a very clearly identified local area to the project. So it's firmly focused on the communities that are hosting it. What the county has suggested is that there are possibilities of having both a fund that is entirely locally based, but then also some of those funds going into a strategic or more regional type fund. And we are supportive of that, really for two reasons. One is that it means that urban areas who are unlikely to have the large projects right next door to them also are seeing some of the benefits and getting the benefit from the energy transition. Totally respect that it is, you'd expect there to be more benefit going to local areas, but I think it's not unreasonable to say that strategic funds can make sure that you are spreading that. And for example, areas which tend to be more urban, densely populated, where you have some of the people who are most at risk of being left behind in the energy transition, like there's an argument that we make as an energy business that the energy transition ought to be supporting people to get through that process. And so it's very much about saying, money coming from energy projects, helping people with their experience of this transition. It also enables activities to be funded that require economies of scale and joining up with existing services, which doesn't mean that they can't actually be deployed in the local host community, but that you want to run that operation at a wider level. And I guess there's two examples that come to mind. One for us is that we run something called Energy Solutions Oxfordshire, which is support for small and medium enterprises to reduce their carbon emissions and their energy bills. And we offer free funded assessments, and we also offer grant funding, part grant funding up to £10,000 or 25% of implementing measures for businesses in Oxfordshire from our community benefit fund. And also we manage contributions of funding from other organisations through that as well. We have deployed funds on quite local levels. We've done that in Tame, for example, and we can make it happen, but the overhead in doing it is very high, because to go out and find the beneficiaries in a very small geographic area is actually quite hard. If you're operating that across a county level, it's much, much easier. And then you can do some localization and you can try and, focus on a particular priority area, but you're managing your costs across the whole thing. And the same would go for something like home energy advice and fuel poverty support, where, yes, you can still prioritize certain areas to be looking for the beneficiaries, but actually that's a service, or the things that you might fund that are kind of additional to what's happening already. You need to join up with those things that are happening already, and those things that happen already happen at a regional scale. So the joining up kind of has to be regional, or it doesn't really work out that well. You end up with a lot of duplication. So that's the two reasons on that one. I realise I'm talking a lot more than I said I would. Let's skip on, Hal. Roles and responsibilities. As I said, I think I covered this actually in that question about community representation and the bit about how they've laid that out. So ultimately, mostly fine, but we think that they should take a nimble approach to this. We don't want it to be overly complex. And so I really would say they should be thinking this as there are going to be the first 5 projects that come forward if this is adopted. Think about going in and taking those as your first case studies, learning as you're going, and not overly complicating things at the outset. Next one is community action plan. So in the document, what it is saying is that the distribution of funds from community benefit funds should be governed or have an approach that is captured in a community action plan. So I think the good thing about this is it's saying that those funds should have priorities that are written down so that it's transparent, and that allows people to have a say in what they are. It could be quite engagement to get something really fully bought into might be hard, but nonetheless, if you write something down, people can see it and they can have a say, and it's transparent and you can be held accountable to it. So all of that is fine, and I'm given some confidence in this because actually this comes from Scotland and they're already implementing that. and it seems to be working quite well. So again, our position is this is mostly fine, but again, allow the discretion. And we also do think, though, that it would be good, particularly in kind of at the beginning, if there were other equivalently useful plans in place, then they should be accepted, even if they perhaps aren't the widest scope that they could be. Don't not crack on with creating community benefit because you didn't get the specific spec of plan. You know, get going with things that are in place and that have buy-in and have a, you know, it's responsible. And examples of that could be if you've got parish level plans, you know, for anything, frankly. But if you've got, well, Pride in Place, so the Leeds, Greater Leeds area in the east of Oxford has successfully secured Pride in Place funding. They will be producing a whole load of priorities and themes and a vision for what they want the future of that place to look like. To me, that's the obvious thing that you hang this on. You don't need to do it again. And similarly, we have worked in and around Aynsham on a community action plan for zero carbon energy. So it specifically focuses on energy. It's not wider. Totally understand that those funds, local funds, would be spent for things that aren't to do with energy. But, you know, in the meantime, would it not be responsible to say there's already been a consultation process, there's already been a sensible mechanism for putting something together along with anything else that's in place in the area? Can those not be candidates for allocating some money so that people see the benefits as soon as possible? Because in the end, this is about massive change happening in the country, and this is meant to be about showing that that can benefit people and generating acceptance of that change, making it easier for people. So let's not wait. And we will be sharing the challenges about, you know, that we've had in delivering those cap zeros just as part of our feedback. But again, we don't want it to be overly complicated. And I've already talked through the shared ownership side, so we don't need to repeat that one.